Hello and welcome to Skywalks Gaming. So let's get this started. Alright, so we're going to get started here and talk about consoles from the past. Hey Lorenzo Gaming, welcome to the channel. I hope you can hear me okay. If you can, please say yes in the chat. Hopefully you can. It looks like everything's working correctly, but I just can't tell. But let me get logged into my own account on my phone. Oh, you can hear me? Okay, cool. That is really cool. All right, so we're going to talk a little about old gaming consoles from the past. Used to play Fallout 4. Yes, we did. And I may play that again at some point. I don't know. I don't know if I'll be doing any more gaming on this channel, but it depends on what's going on with YouTube. I've sort of been biding my time with Twitch, and I'm still streaming on Twitch, and I have streamed Fallout 4 on Twitch, and I will continue to stream Fallout 4 on Twitch occasionally. I've sort of moved on, but I do occasionally do that, and I am building a little bit more on No Man's Sky, so you can come join me over there at Twitch. And if you don't know where that is, I'll go ahead and write that into the chat. It says sign in to chat. Let me see. Alright, I don't know what's going to happen when I click on that. Alright, let me see if I can actually say anything over here now. No. It just shows it to me on the right side of the screen, which is fine. I have to chat on a different device. So if I'm going to do that, I might as well do it on my phone. But give me a second and let me get my phone set up for that. It's just going to take a moment for me to get over there. No, that's not the one. Oh, here it is. Alright, so I am able to chat on my phone. Alright, so we are looking at, this is the Magnavox Odyssey, so we'll go ahead and get started here. This was actually one of the very first consoles that came out. It's not the very first console because there was one that was in the 60s that was slightly older than this one, and it didn't have cartridges. This is the first one I think that had a cartridge slot on it. So I did not own an Odyssey, but it was one of the very first gaming consoles available. There, like I said, there was a slightly older one than this one, and I forget the name of it, but it is available. Lorenzo, yes. I really wish Fallout 4 was multiplayer so that we could play it together. But yes, anyway, let's talk about Magnavox Odyssey. So let me bring up my Brave browser here so I can sort of scroll down in this. You guys can see. This is actually Wikipedia. I'm just looking at Wikipedia because they have a lot of good information about these consoles. And this was actually produced by Magnavox, and there was actually a light gun that went with it, and there was other things that you could get as well. This controller was a bit odd, but it was functional. You could do things with it. And so this is one of the very first gaming consoles. This is the cartridge here. when you guys can see it. Magnavox Odyssey cartridge number 6. Apparently they just numbered them, and they have really long pins. But, you know, I guess at the time they weren't exactly sure how to make cartridges that would work properly. But I guess at the same time that was the cartridge that was developed. And here's another picture of more of them with them stacked up. So anyway, that's the Odyssey. This was released September 1972, kind of a long time ago, but there it is. Now this is the console that probably everyone remembers, the Atari 2600. This was the one that really kicked off cartridge-based gaming in earnest. This is the one that came out in when did it release? 1977. I didn't buy it in 1977. In fact, I didn't buy one of these at all. I ended up buying a Coleco that had an Atari emulator on it. I'll show you that in a bit. But this looks like originally branded as Atari VCS, Video Computer System, for short until November 1982, is a home console. Yeah, okay. So basically, this had ROM cartridges. This is probably the one that's best known for its cartridges because its cartridges were big and bulky and easy to handle, and you could put them right in. I was just if there's a picture of a cartridge here anywhere on this page. There is not a picture of a cartridge on this page, which is interesting. Okay. But this console spawned the best joystick probably that's ever been on a console. This console joystick is one of the best known console joysticks ever. And this is, and you know, honestly, this is what a lot of gaming consoles still strive to give you in terms of joysticks. We all have thumbsticks now on the little tiny thumbsticks that are on the controllers. And I would say the thumbsticks are okay. They're good. They do what they do. But it's having one of these big joysticks in your hand with the button is actually it's a very tactile sensation. It's actually quite nice. It's nicer than, say, the sort of hefty, big game pads that we have today. Although the game pads we have today actually have a lot more functionality, so that's good. And there were a lot of consoles that started to add later functionality, like let's see, which one? Well, the Colecovision had that. So the Colecovision started, and they had this joystick that, well, again, it had a big joystick, but it started to move down in size. So I wouldn't say it was a thumbstick exactly, but it was a joystick. And I did have one of these, and I really liked this console a lot. The graphics were, yeah, fair. They were better. They were high res. They were more high res than the Atari. But they weren't great by any stretch. The 5200 was probably its closer brethren, and you can see its joystick looks like this. We'll come to the 5200 in a minute. It's one of these windows I have up here, and I can't really see them. I have to hover over them. 7800. Okay, 5200. Yeah, so let's go to the 5200 because you can see the joystick a little better. So when you go to the 5200, this is another one that had started adding buttons and on here. Its joystick was horrible. It wasn't the worst joystick ever made by Atari, but this is one of the worst joysticks that Atari made. The worst one though was on the 7800. The 7800, well, actually both of them, to be perfectly fair. The 7800 and the 5200 joysticks were awful, and they broke very, very easily. So yeah, these were kind of okay systems. They worked better, of course. They still had cartridges, but the joysticks were absolutely horrible. And that was one of the biggest complaints for most players was the joystick. I mean, you either have a really great joystick and it works awesome, or you have a really crappy joystick and it doesn't work very well. And that was the case on both the 5200 and the 7200. And these were the successors of the 2600. Let's see. Around the same time, there were some other interesting systems that came out that added joysticks and stuff. This one probably had more of a console-esque kind of feel to it. It had this, it was basically an all-in-one. It had this joystick that popped out of the bottom, and it had a TV the vertical TV built into it that was a raster scan, and it was effectively like there aren't very many games like this these days, but I forget the name of it, but there were a lot of, let's see, some of the storms they had on some of the games they had on there were like Mindstorm. Um, let's see, where's a list of, do they have a list of software here? List of Vectrex games. Berserk, yeah, Clean Sweep, Mindstorm, Pole Position, Space Wars, Star Castle. The one I was thinking of is not here, which is surprising it's not here because it was a very common, very common game in the arcades at the time. I'll think of it. I haven't played it in so long. I really should have looked some of these games up before I started this stream, but I was battling problems with OBS, so I just kind of gave up with OBS and said, "Let the hell with it. Let's just go for it." And so OBS is open broadcasting software, and it's what's actually enabling me to produce this. First console was the Intellivision. Yes, we're coming to that one. So the Intellivision is where is that one in my list of consoles up here? I thought I actually had it up here. Let's just look it up. I did have it open, but I must have closed the tab. So yeah, this is the Intellivision. This is also one of my favorite consoles. The 2600 was one of my favorite consoles, but the Intellivision was also one of my favorite consoles. And this is the Intellivision. Though I didn't have the Intellivision, I had the Intellivision 2. I don't know if there's an article for that in here. No, it just shows this one. So the Intellivision 2 was smaller. It had the same kind of joysticks, but it was a smaller console. It was basically it was. Let's see if there's a picture of it. Oh, this is the IntelliVoice. This was a talking add-on, and there were certain games that would play that could talk. There were only about 6 of them. Actually, no, this looks like the 4 of them. Yeah, 5th. Okay, here, 5 titles that could talk. This is it, the Intellivision 2, right here. So this is the one I owned. I really liked the Intellivision 2. I thought it was a great console. This is where they started putting membrane buttons on the joypads, and this is really sort of the introduction of a thumbstick, because this you had to press down and move it around in a with your thumb. So this was kind of like the first iteration of a thumbstick. So the Intellivision really was the first to sort of add the idea of using your thumb to push and mash the joystick button. But this is kind of like a cross between a D-pad and a joystick. So you kind of got the best of both worlds with the way that they had this recessed button there. But the membrane buttons for the numbers were horrible because they would, after use, they would crack and peel and start having problems. So you'd have all this plastic sort of peeling up. Really, which was kind of the problem with these membranes. I wasn't a big fan of membrane keyboards. It happened even on computers too. Like, I forget which Atari it was. Let me see. Is it one of these? No. But yeah, the Intellivision was a great unit. It had lots of good games on it. Let's see if we can find a list of all the games. List of Intellivision games. Yes. So boxing, soccer, football. There's a lot of stuff here. Oh yes, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. This is one of the better cartridges. It was a simplistic game, but it was one of the very first sort of RPG questing kind of games that had come out for a console. And so if you were looking for RPG adventure kind of stuff, this was a great game on that console, was Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. By today's standards, it's very rudimentary, but at the time it was a great game. So if you were doing that kind of stuff there, this was awesome. Came out in 1982, it looks like. Let's see, Lock and Chase. Some of these don't have images. Oh, Shark Shark. This was actually a conversion from an arcade game, I believe. This was Tron. There were a couple of Tron Mesotron, Tron Deadly Discs. The Tron Mesotron was kind of awful, but Deadly Discs was actually not too bad. Anyway, you can come over here, and if you come over here, you can look at all these cartridges that were available. There's a lot of them available. 118 cartridges plus one compilation cartridge, 16 cartridges for the ECS, 8 cassettes, and there was a cassette. Oh, I didn't realize there was a cassette system for the Intellivision. That's news to me. All right, then there was some. This is the Colecovision. Coleco also released a different console updated. It was kind of weird. They decided they wanted to get into computer systems, so they decided to go into manufacturing of the Coleco Atom, and this was a home computer that came with what you see on the screen here, but it also had a printer, a dot matrix printer, or was it? No, it wasn't a dot matrix printer. It was a it was like a Selectric, well, IBM Selectric, where it had just letters to type it out. But I forget what you call those types of media. But basically, it printed just letters on there. But it was actually quite decent for a console. There were two versions of this. This was the standalone version, and it had a cassette drive. The cassette drive is awful, but if you had the version that was a combination ColecoVision and computer. Yeah, this is the setup. This is the whole setup here. It did not come with a monitor, so you had to buy your own monitor. But this is the whole setup. If you had the version that was an add-on for your ColecoVision, then you also had the cartridges. I don't remember if there was a cartridge slot on the Atom by itself. Let's see. Expansion version. I don't see that it has ColecoVision expansion port. Yeah, I don't think it actually. I think if you bought the computer standalone, it did not have a cartridge port on it. It might have, but I can't remember for sure. Anyway, this is a sort of combination video gaming system and computer. So it was like one of the very first where they dove into doing both at the same time. Another one was Mattel. Mattel jumped in too, and that would have been with this, the Mattel Aquarius, and this was another one that came out in 1983. I don't know if you guys remember this one, but it was an interesting thing. Mattel decided they wanted to jump into the computer video gaming system kind of thing, and this is what they produced. And there was apparently an Aquarius 2 as well. As far as I know, it didn't. Let's see, it didn't go over that well, and it didn't sell that well. But there were a number of people who bought these. I didn't buy one of these because I already had the ColecoVision, and I wasn't going to spend for another computer just because it was there. And it was also kind of expensive. How much is it? 160? Yeah, about $160, I guess. I think the price was like that. Oops. Let's go back to... come on, what are you doing? All right. And then you guys might remember this one. This is super old. This is Timex Sinclair 1000. This was really more of a computer than it was video gaming, but there was some video games that were on this computer, and you could actually write your own. This is about $100 for this thing, and it ran basic, but it did have some games that you could get for it. Very rudimentary, very basic, black and white, but it did have games. Not too many. Now, as we move in time, you might remember the Commodore 64. This was also around 1982 when it came out, and this was very, very common. This was not only a computer, primarily a computer, but it was also a video game machine because it did have a cartridge slot on it. It didn't have too many games on the cartridge, but it did have a lot. I mean, it did have some. Let's see if there's a list of cartridges that it had, but most of its stuff were computer related. Yeah, game cartridges, but how many did it have? That's the question. I did not own one of these specifically, at least not at the time. But I don't see, there's a list of cartridges. Let's see, list. List of Commodore 64 games. Well, there are 1,300 titles, but I don't know how many of those 1,300 were actually on cartridges. Many of them were on floppies, because you could buy floppies for this guy. And that was the common way to do it. What is this? The C64 Web IT Internet Computer? Okay. Yeah, I know that people have created some clones of it recently. Yeah, right here you can talk about. If you come down to Wikipedia, you can read through all this and get this. This is the floppy drive that was with it, and there was another one here on the 1541 and the 1541-2, and then there was a disc cassette drive for it. There was a printer, all kinds of extra stuff. That mouse looks like the Amiga mouse, to be perfectly honest. The Commodore 1351 mouse almost, I think that is the Amiga mouse, to be honest, because it looks like the Amiga mouse. And we're about to talk about Amiga, so we won't get there yet. Right after this one was released, so this is sort of, I'm still going into these because these are video, halfway between video games and computers. So I'm sort of, this is in the time frame where computer manufacturers couldn't really figure out, should we make computers or should we make consoles? And so they were kind of straddling the line between the two, trying to figure out where they could sell stuff the best. And so that's why Commodore 64 is still probably one of the most widely remembered computers and video gaming platforms out there, other than the Atari 2600, because it was so widely purchased. Units sold 12.5 to 17 million. That's a lot of units. Let's see. And then there was the Commodore 128, which bombed. So this one, let's see how many sold. 5.7 million worldwide. Yeah, well, I wouldn't exactly say that's a bomb, but it did pretty much bomb. This is the Commodore 128. This was the follow-on to the 64. It did okay, but it just didn't sell as well. There was some problems with it. And if you look at it, it actually looks quite a bit like the Amiga 500 in terms of case design, and we'll look at that here in a minute. But this was designed by a lot of the same people who designed the Amiga. So I'm not even quite sure why they released this at the time they did, because shortly after this was released, the Amiga was released. So it's kind of a weird overlap thing where you have the Commodore the C128, and then you also have the Amiga that comes out about the same time. And that's this one here. And the Amiga was released July 23rd, 1985, and the 128 was released, when does it say? January 1985. Or introduced, yes. So, you know, like 6 months later, they're introducing the Amiga, and this is the Amiga 500. So if you can see that the Amiga 500, in fact, look at that mouse. That mouse looks almost the same as the one that was on the C64. So I think they just absconded with that same mouse and put it on the Amiga. But anyway, this is the Amiga 500, and if you compare it against the 128, you can see the design looks pretty much the same, or very, very similar. I mean, it's a brighter, whiter color. That could just be simply because they used that bright whitener stuff on it before they took the picture. The Amiga was a little bit more beige in color in general, but I don't know if it was exactly that color, but it probably was. This wasn't the 1000. The Amiga 1000 was looked a little different than this, but what they're showing there is a 500, which came out in 1987. The Amiga 1000 came out in 1985. So I don't understand why the 1000 was released at the same time as the 128. It didn't really make sense. But we won't talk about the bankruptcies and all that stuff, because that just kind of delves real deep into Amiga and Commodore stupidity. But just suffice it to say that the Amiga lasted for about 10 years on the market. It started in 85 and died about 1995. So it had a good 10-year run. And then, of course, around the time there was also the Apple II, the Apple II Plus, the Apple IIc, There was a bunch of Apples that came out around the same time as the Amiga, and these were also very common. These were less video gaming and more computery. They were designed more for being a computer and less for being video games. Though you could play games on it, there just weren't that many games. And this was the Apple stuff. I only bring the Apple stuff up because you can't forget Apple in all of this. They were out there releasing these computers as well. They were just very, very expensive. And you can see this was about $1,300 versus the Amiga 500, which cost, well, I guess around the same price, to be honest, for the 1000. The 500 wasn't that pricey, though. The Amiga 500 is much cheaper than that. Let's see. I was going to bring up another console. Oh, I forgot about this one. So this was another one that was around the same time as the TI-99 4A. You guys might remember this. This also had a cartridge slot right in the front in that big sort of recessed black area. And it had ROM cartridges that also supported video games. Unfortunately, it was not very, very well adopted in terms of video gaming. Unfortunately, it was... wasn't a bad console. In fact, it had graphics that were very similar to the ColecoVision, considering its release date. But it probably had a bunch of games too. Let me see if there's any games. Lack of third-party development. Yeah. The TI-99 is more sophisticated than the VIC-20. I didn't talk about the VIC-20, but there was the VIC-20 there. I should probably bring that one up just to compare it, because they're comparing it to the VIC-20. So this was Commodore's other computer called the VIC-20. Slightly different, but looks very similar to the 64. And it... I don't quite understand why they even had the VIC-20. Roughly 3 years after Commodore's personal computer, the PET. Yes, the PET was also another one before that time. There were plenty of these around the time, but these are not really video gaming. They are, but they aren't. People did video game on them. The one that people really did game on was the Amiga. So if you really wanted a video game system and a computer all in one, this was the one to get, because there were thousands of video games for this. Some very, very good video games. Discontinued 1996. Okay, well, they made it to 11 years then. But there were many, many, many games on this. And it still kind of goes on today, because I think that Amiga OS 4 is still being maintained and people are releasing it somewhere in the world. I haven't kept up with the Amiga updates and stuff, but it's still out there. The Amiga's main problem was lack of expandability. In order to get anything better for it, you had to buy a brand new version of it. And that was really their downfall, was that it didn't really have very much expandability. Even the 3000, the A3000, which had slots and stuff, just didn't have enough to be able to deal with it. So let's see. Trying to think of any. There was another one that I was trying to think of. So there were a lot of arcade games around the time that influenced all of these systems. Oh, it was the NES. That was the other one I want to bring up now. The NES, which obviously I can't forget. Not the Super NES, just the NES, the original NES. So this was the first Nintendo system, and it basically came in after the ColecoVision kind of died. So the ColecoVision was a really big thing for a while, had a lot of great titles on it. Even had some Nintendo titles that had Donkey Kong and a bunch of the Donkey Kong titles. But the ColecoVision died because Coleco did some bad things, and so the Nintendo decided to release their own system, and they came in with the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES, which in other countries was called the Famicom, or Family Computer. In Japan, it was known as the Famicom. So anyway, this was the first one that got released. What year did this come out? July 1983. Yeah. So basically right after the time ColecoVision died. And so this is where all really heavy video gaming came in. I'm sure a lot of people remember this one with lots of fun and sitting around playing video games. Donkey Kong Jr., all those fun games. So there's lots of stuff, lots of peripherals were available for this guy, guns and all kinds of stuff. Oh, I forgot about Rob, Robotic Operating Buddy. They actually created an amiibo for that. 1985's launch, although it ended up having a short production life, Rob was initially used to market the NES as novel and sophisticated compared to previous game consoles. I remember Rob. I just thought it looked like a toy, but I guess it was useful in some way. I don't know. But this is where kind of the joypad began to show up. But they weren't the only ones that had the joypad. Obviously, they had this joypad, the big square joypad with a D-pad on the left and 2 buttons on the right. But there were plenty of those. So let's see. They discontinued this in '95. Oh, it lasted that long. Now the Super NES, we'll look at that one next. Wait, this is the classic edition. Wait, what am I getting into here? Oh, this is the tiny version of it. This is the new updated little thing that they built a few, like a year ago or 2 years ago. So this is the Super Famicom. This was the update to the other one. This was released in 1990 in Japan and 1991 in North America and 1992 in Europe. Wow, I didn't realize all those dates. So anyway, this is what they released, and I remember this one, and I came very close to buying one of these. I didn't buy it, but I just decided not to because I already had enough gaming consoles at the time. In fact, I was well into the Amiga by this point that I decided that why do I need a console? So I just kept going with my Amiga and didn't really purchase into this. All I probably should have, but I didn't. They sold how many of these things? Let's see. I don't have all these numbers in my head because there's just too much of this stuff to remember. So in North America, they sold 23.35 million of these. Worldwide, 49.10 million. So that's way more than some of the other ones we were talking about earlier. Best-selling game was Super Mario World, Donkey Kong Country, Super Mario Kart, and Street Fighter 2. Yeah, that makes sense. Now there were other sort of lesser consoles that came out in the 90s, like I got to think of well, there was a bunch of handhelds as well, right? Because the Game Boy came out also around, I forget when did that one came out? 89. So yes, this was still in the 80s when Game Boy released. And you guys might remember the Game Boy. So there were a lot of handhelds that sort of came out. But you have to remember that Nintendo really started in the handheld market. That was their thing. When they first started out, small handhelds was what they were known for, not consoles. And so this kind of a Game Boy thing was, you'd sort of expect this from Nintendo because this is what they were looking for. Then, obviously we expanded on from that to the Super Game Boy, or what was it called? Game Boy Advanced. And then the Game Boy SP. There was a bunch of these. This was the Advance and Game Boy SP, which was, I think, the clamshell version. Yeah. So there were a bunch of these Game Boys, and this is where they started with the color and stuff. And I really liked the Game Boy Advance. This was one of my favorite handhelds because of the size of it. This is really where they started with the clamshell design. It was the first of the single screens, but then they obviously doubled the screen with the DS. But this was the sort of the first time they sort of pushed out this clamshell design, and they've sort of been keeping this clamshell design going ever since. Now, I don't know if they're going to keep up with the. I think they've sort of, because of the Switch, they've sort of discontinued the Game Boy line. Although that's kind of sad, but I think it's what they're going to do. But anyway, that's sort of, we're getting sort of way into the future here. This came out in 2003. Yeah, so we're way up into 2003 with this one. But let's see. The one that really bombed for Nintendo was the Game Boy VR. What was it called? Game Boy Game. I forget what it was called. Game Boy. Anyway, it was this ugly headset. I have to look it up. Game Boy VR. Virtual Boy, that was what it was called. Okay. Virtual Boy. And there was this horrible thing. This was it here. And it was one of the very first sort of virtual headsets that came out. But the interior of it was basically red LED, and it was hard for your eyes. People hated it. It bombed hard. How many did it sell? 770,000 units. And probably only half of them, if any of them still exist. I'm sure some still exist, but if the few that still exist, probably about half of them. I'm sure half of them are broken at this point. So if you're really interested in putting a museum together of these things, then you should. This is probably one you should look for really quick, because there's not going to be very many of them out there. This came out in 1995, so we're up into the 90s with this one. About 5 years after their Game Boy. Their original Game Boy in '89, maybe 6 years after. So these, I think this had a cartridge slot on it. I'm not entirely sure where it is. Maybe it's right here on the back. It had, yeah, red monochrome display. The game uses parallax effect to create illusion of depth. Sales failed to meet targets, and by early 1996, Nintendo ceased distribution and game development, having released only 22 games for the system. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. I remember when it came out, and I remember that that it bombed. So this was one of those that was just not very well received. There were a lot of very good consoles out there, like the 2600. Where is that one? This one sold quite well. How many total? 30 million as of 2004. Well, these numbers are hard to quantify, because I really want to know how many they sold, say, in the first 5 years. And I don't know the answer to that question, because right now they're just counting lifetime totals versus during its peak. Now let's see if the ColecoVision. Let's see, do they have the Atari 2600 adapter? Yes. Okay, so this is how I owned a 2600 right here. Was on the ColecoVision with the 2600 adapter, and you plugged it into the front of the unit, and then you could plug 2600 cartridges into it, and it would play 2600 games, and then you could play using the ColecoVision joysticks. And I preferred that because I really liked the ColecoVision joysticks, but it was a good system, and it worked well, and it didn't crash. I mean, I would say one of the things I would say about these really early video game units in the late 70s, early 80s was they were rock stable. The games did not crash on you. They wouldn't blue screen of death or any of that stuff. They would work, and you could play them for hours, and they would just keep playing, and they were like workhorses. So that's one of the things I will say about this. We didn't get all these crashing games and crashing consoles and PS4s that crash like every 30 minutes. That stuff didn't happen back in this heyday of gaming. People made their games rock solid. It was very, very rare where you had to reset your console. It did happen occasionally, but not that often. Let's see, what is this? Flashback? This must be one of those legacy release things. What are they talking about that here? They aren't even talking about it. At 2014, AtGames began producing the ColecoVision Flashback console that includes 60 games, but not the original pack-in game Donkey Kong. Well, yeah, they can't release Donkey Kong likely because of rights with Nintendo. Which is unfortunate, because that was one of its primary stay games, was Donkey Kong. was one of the very first consoles that actually carried Donkey Kong. But it wasn't just Donkey Kong that it had a bunch. Let's see, list of ColecoVision games. Let's go look at them. I know I'm kind of bouncing around here, but it's kind of hard to not bounce around when you're talking about consoles from the same era. So Donkey Kong Jr. I think there was a couple of others. Frogger was here, Galaxian. Let's see. I swear there was at least one more kind of Donkey Kong. Mr. Do was here, Mousetrap. These were well-known arcade games at the time. Pepper 2. Pitfall. Yeah, they moved Pitfall over from Activision. Activision sort of embraced this console. Qbert. Qbert was fun. Not so much on this console, but it was fun. It was a fun game. Okay, so I guess it was primarily just Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong 2 that were Nintendo property. Yeah, that looks like it. IGN named the ColecoVision their 12th best video game console out of their list of 25, citing its incredible accuracy in bringing current generation arcade hits home. And that's actually very true. I'm glad they brought that up. One of the great things about ColecoVision was the faithfulness of bringing arcade games that look like the arcade game into the home, whereas Atari 2600 made their own 2600 version of arcade games. They never really quite look like what they did in the arcade, versus the ColecoVision, which always tried to make the games look just like they did or very close to like they did in the arcade. So if you played in the arcade and you went home and you played it on your ColecoVision, you go, wow, they look almost identical. And that was one of the things that I was very impressed with ColecoVision, that they maintained that continuity between the arcade and the home console, where a lot of arcade games didn't. Even Nintendo didn't really do that as well as ColecoVision. I would say that's probably one of the strongest points of the ColecoVision was its accuracy for when compared to the arcade version. So let's see what else we got here. I have a couple more open here. Talked about that. Talked about that. Apple. So one of the reasons I bring up Apple is because Apple's one of the first computers that I actually played another game on, which was Ultima. The Ultima series of games was actually a very good series of games. Ultima. It was like Ultimate 2, maybe. No. Game. Not cosmetics, thanks. Yeah, it was Apple II Ultima. It's this one here. I'm not going to open it up, but let's see if there's some images we can see of it. Yeah, so I mean, it's this very rudimentary looking game, but it was also kind of an RPG. So at the same time, even though it looked very rudimentary, what you could do with it was quite not going to say complex, but quite involved, as more the word. I'm not going to go into YouTube to watch this, but if you really want to go to YouTube, you can watch all these Ultima 2 stuffs. This is Apple II Ultima 2. This is what I played around 1982. This was an interesting game. It was fun, and I enjoyed playing it. I haven't played it since originally that time, but yeah, it was a good game, and it was much better. The resolution was much better quality than, say, at the time, the Atari 2600, because the Atari 2600 looked sort of like this. Very blocky, very pixelated. Yeah, like this. So this is basically what the Atari's graphics looked like. They were very flat. They were not at all 3D, of course. But they were very, very rudimentary, blocky types of structures like this. The Intellivision actually looked much better than this. Because the Intellivision had improved resolution quite a bit. I mean, it's still blocky and pixely, but they added more color to it, and it just had more an arcade feel for the Intellivision. It wasn't perfect by any stretch, but it did have slightly better resolution. Colecovision, let's look at their graphics. So this is what Donkey Kong looked like on the ColecoVision. This is a better picture of it. And you can see it's pretty accurate to the arcade version. Sorry, bumped the microphone. And this is Zaxxon. So it always felt like you were playing an arcade game. This is Burger Time. I always liked Burger Time. Kind of a silly game, but you know, it is what it is. It was an arcade game. And I forget what this one is. I think there, like, Mr. Do was out as well. Mr. Do. Yeah, that was Mr. Do. Now, this is probably one of the worst versions, I would say. The ColecoVision Mr. Do did not look like the arcade. So this is what the arcade version looks like. And then this is what the version looked like on the ColecoVision. And I always thought it looked kind of weak. They didn't do a very good conversion of Mr. Do. Or I guess more like that. So it was not as good as the arcade version. So when you get the arcade version and you're playing the arcade, this is what it looked like in the arcade. Of course, the arcade had slightly better graphics than the ColecoVision had. But I still think they could have done a better job with it on the ColecoVision for Mr. Do. I don't know if you like any of these older games, but some of them are fun to play. You can get them, you can play them on MAME now. So if you're really interested in playing some of these older games, you can definitely play them on MAME or one of the emulators. MAME emulator. So this is the MAME project. Now it's not the only emulator out there, but you can pick it up and you can play all kinds of games. I don't know what's going on with this, why it's not showing the whole image here, but whatever. It looks like there's versions for Linux, Apple, and download. So if you're interested in some of these older platforms like ColecoVision, Atari 2600, and some of these those ones I just mentioned, Intellivision, you can pick up games and play them on MAME, and they'll play them pretty much as those systems originally played them. So if you really want to see what some of those games actually look like in action, just go out to MAME and look it up. All right, so let's see. Let's go into the 90s and talk a little about the 90s. So before the Amiga, or actually after the Amiga began to wane, Commodore tried to do something different, and they created a different kind of unit called a CD32, and this is what it looks like, but not like that. Commodore CD32. Amiga, oh, they're calling it Amiga CD32, whatever. So this is the Amiga CD32. This was one of the final things that they kind of built as a last gen console. It was 32-bit, and it had a CD drive built into it, and it was kind of like Amiga's version of a console. It really was technically an Amiga in a small case, so it never really turned into a computer. You couldn't make it a computer, but it was. Some people wanted to hack it into one, but you couldn't. But it did have a joypad of sorts that came with it. And it wasn't a bad joypad, actually. It was sort of getting to be more modern at that point. This was released in 94. And this was around the time that I think the Super NES was there, and the Jaguar Atari, which bombed. I forget when this one released. Yeah, this also released in, well, 93. So this was the Atari Jaguar. This thing bombed hard. It was supposedly the first 64-bit video game system is the claim, but it never really kind of lived up to that hype. And the games never looked very good on it. And there were also, and the thing is at the time, the Segas were out. Sega Genesis, it came out, and it arrived in, well, actually this was 1989. I completely forgot that this came out in 89. I was thinking this came out in the 90s. Let's see. Well, technically I guess it did, because it released, well, no, it released August 14th. Okay. And it lasted until 1987, but around the time that the Atari Jaguar was released, the Sega, I forget what the expansion thing was called. Maybe there's a picture of it here. Sega Genesis Power Base Converter, was that it? No, I don't think that was it. No, it was this thing that sits on the top with a 32X add-on. Yeah, this is it. So around that time, they Genesis added the 32X add-on, which supposedly added some additional processing power for better gaming experiences. I don't think it went over that well, but you could get it, and it added this sort of big honking thing on the top of your console that kind of got in the way. But, you know, I guess it was a way for them to expand the console without actually building a brand new one. Yeah, the 32X. And then the Sega Saturn, of course, came after that. Which, let's see, 95. How well did this thing sell? Probably not very. 9.26 million. Yeah, it didn't sell that well. So this was around the same time that the Amiga was released, the Amiga Console, and this one pretty much kind of took over for a short period of time. It was also another CD console. This actually looks very much, the white one looks very much like the Sega Dreamcast that came out a few years later. You could tell. The Dreamcast was actually a very good console. I like this. Came out in 98, just a few years later. I really liked the Dreamcast. It had great graphics. You could hook it up to a VGA monitor. There was lots of cool things you could do with this, but it just wouldn't last. Sega was on their last legs. Couldn't figure out how to make the console sell. Sort of lost developer support. There was a lot of things that happened all at once that prevented this console from really taking off as well as it could have. But anyway, this was one of my favorite consoles from the modern generation of consoles, and I would consider this still modern. It didn't last very long. When did it go out of production? 2001. Yeah, so it lasted what, 3 years? I guess it's not bad for a console. How many units did it sell? 9.13 million. Yeah, I honestly think they could have sold more of these. To be honest, the innards of this particular console were actually the same as the innards of the arcades, Sega's arcade games. They just, like this was one board versus their arcade games where they stacked like multiple boards side by side in order to give more processing power. This was just one of those boards put into a case and called the Dreamcast. So they were basically using the same driving boards in the Dreamcast as they were in their arcade units. And a lot of people didn't know that, which is one of the reasons why many of the games on the Dreamcast looked pretty much identical to what came out on their console unit or their arcade units, because they were able to just port everything over almost directly. Now, I won't get into technical specs here. You can look at all the technical specs here on Wikipedia if you're really interested. So let's see. Let me go look at some Dreamcast images. You guys can see what the Dreamcast looks like. Get spell. Code Veronica. Shenmue was there. Shenmue was a great game. There actually was last year was released Shenmue 3 in around November. It got mixed reviews, but the first Shenmue was on Sega Dreamcast, and it was actually a very good, very, very good game on the Dreamcast. So here's a list of all the games. I want to see if we can see pictures of them. Yeah, so this is what Sonic looked like on it. I mean, it had a very similar kind of look and feel as the PS2. So if you want to look at PS2 games side by side, you get similar kinds of graphics. If there's any pictures of graphics, they're all like box art. I mean, it's funny, we played all these back then and we didn't think anything of it, but you know, this is what they look like back then. Nintendo 64. I kind of glossed over this one. This was another one that came in around mid 90s, and it's what it looked like. Let me look at the Wikipedia article for it. So it sold 32.93 million units worldwide. That doesn't surprise me because it was a very popular console. Although I hated the controller. I really hated that three-prong controller. It was a horrible controller to manage. Um, it was not at all comfortable in the hands, and it was an awkward shape to hold. It was probably one of the worst console controllers I think I've held. It wasn't unreliable. The buttons worked and the joystick worked and the D-pad worked. Everything worked. It was just a completely uncomfortable and non-ergonomic controller. It really felt bad in the hands. One of the worst controllers I think I've seen on a console. But the console itself was a great console. Had a bunch of great games, particularly its most popular games. One was GoldenEye. The other one obviously was Mario, Super Mario. I think it was Super Mario World, actually. Those two were very, very popular. We played the hell out of those games on that console. What does it say? Silicon Graphics. Okay. Yeah, it was developed. I think it had something. SGI had some hand in helping build the Nintendo 64. I think they used either software, maybe some hardware inside of it. I don't know exactly. But there was also this thing that went in this little door that's on the top of the console. This little, I think it was just a memory cartridge actually, that just gave it a little bit more memory. But it was kind of a dumb thing. I don't even know if it really gave more memory, to be honest. I think it was just a dumb thing that they made us buy. I think it was just a way to spend 20 bucks and not actually get anything out of it. Let's see. I'm trying to figure out. The expansion pack allows random access memory of Nintendo 64 console to increase from 4 megabytes to 8 megabytes of contiguous main memory with the help of an included key. The expansion pack fixed in the slot. Yeah, it was just a way for them to charge more money to unlock a feature that was already in the console. It didn't cost that much, but it was just stupid. It was a stupid thing. It didn't actually, as far as I know, this little key had no memory on it at all. It was just, it shorted some pins out and basically told the console to unlock this extra memory. It was kind of dumb. Let's see. And then that sort of brings us to sort of the more modern day consoles like the Xbox. And I won't go into all the newest Xbox, but I'll show you what they look like. So let's see. And of course, if I missed any consoles in among there, I'm sorry that I missed them. But these were the primary consoles that sort of drove the market at the time. So this was released in 2001, along with the PS2, I believe. Let me see, or maybe it was the PS3. No, PS2, I think. Yeah, 2000 for the PS2, and then 2001 for the original Xbox. And this was the original Xbox, and arguably I would say this is the original Xbox is probably the best Xbox that has been released. Even though the new Xbox is okay, it's fine, it's a good console, but the original Xbox had a really great UI system that they had built for it, and it worked really well. But they later on decided to sort of do away with a lot of that stuff and just make it more. The current one is just basically like Windows 10. It kind of looks and feels like Windows 10. Instead of having sort of a more dedicated console UI. I prefer the more dedicated console UI, but it's just the way that they've decided that they're going to handle this. So how many units did this sell? 24 million plus as of May 2006. So they sold quite a million, quite a million, yes, quite a million, quite a bit of these consoles. Let's see how many PS2 sold. Probably slightly more. Yeah, quite a bit more. 155 million as of March 2012. So the PS2 is sold quite well. Now the PS3, I don't know actually how many PS3s have sold. So the PS3 is obviously the next one after the PS2. And it has sold not quite as well, actually not quite as many as the PS2, 87.4 million. And let's see how many PS4s have sold. Oops, I didn't really want to go back, but I'm not quite used to this browser yet. This is a new browser I'm trying out. This is Brave. And I don't know if it just crashed or what's going on, but it's not taking my key presses. Alright, let's see how many PS4s have sold. 106 million. So they've sold more PS4s than they sold PS3s, which is interesting. I didn't realize that. But let's see, PS4 Pro. Let's see how many total PS4s that have been sold. If there's an article for PS4 Pro. Oh, it just takes me back to this one. So I guess they're including PS4 Pro under this article here. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, that's pretty much the history of consoles. Now, one of the things is there's plenty of games. So if you're interested in any of these consoles, you can go look at all of them. They all have interesting games, some unique to every platform. Like Dungeons and Dragons was a great title that was on the Intellivision, and Atari obviously had Pitfall. That was one. It's really super big title. Colecovision had Donkey Kong. That was its sort of big title. So every console has its sort of super big title, the thing that sort of defines it and is the game that you want to buy for it. But they also had plenty of other games to play on them. Those weren't the only games. It was just that was the predominant game. And usually the reason why most people went out and bought the console because they wanted to play that specific game. Like, I don't know if the PS4 specifically has a one specific game like that anymore. Maybe. I guess you might consider Grand Theft Auto that, or, you know, because I mean, that might be considered a reason to go buy one. Let me see if there's an article for the PS5 yet, just out of curiosity. Oh, there is. The platform is anticipated to launch two varieties as base PlayStation 5 system incorporating Ultra HD Blu-ray compatible optical drive. Well, that's at least something. And games support a long digital distribution and a lower cost digital variant lacking the disk drive while retaining digital download support. They have not yet announced pricing that I know of. One of these days they will announce pricing and I will have a Let's Talk on that. But right now they have not announced pricing. No pricing. They claim Bloomberg estimates the PlayStation price will be at least $470. However, increased revenue from online subscription services may allow Sony greater flexibility in final hardware pricing. No, actually, what it's going to set the hardware pricing is the Xbox Series X. So if Microsoft sets theirs at $399, then PlayStation's going to have to set theirs at the same price. They don't really have a choice, because if they set theirs at $499 and the Xbox Series X is at $399, well, which console is everybody going to run to? Well, they're going to run to the one that's the cheapest. So Sony needs to Sony and Microsoft are now sort of battling who's going to price first and what are we going to price it at. And so I think Sony's waiting for Microsoft to price their console, the Series X. And we talked about this on the last one, but I sort of started with that last time, but I decided to go ahead and do this sort of, let's go back in time and talk about older ones and come up to the current ones so we can talk about the current ones in perspective with the older ones. Now, back at the time, those games were priced around, I want to say originally the 2600 games were priced around $15 to $20, and later on they started going up into the $30 price range. So as the consoles got more and more complex, the prices went up higher and higher. And now we're obviously at the $60 price tag, so it is what it is, right? All right, so let's see. Pricing. Spencer said that Microsoft intends to use a similar Xbox All Access subscription pricing approach. Well, that doesn't help me for the pricing of the hardware. So there is no pricing listed for Xbox Series X, but I expect it to be priced very similarly to the Xbox One X pricing. They're just lumping them all together. That sucks. Yeah, we have the final one that they've released is the Xbox One S All Digital, or as we call it, the Xbox One SAD. SAD. And yes, they got rid of the Kinect. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff talking in here about the Kinect. Kinect is gone. In case you're wondering, it is a non thing anymore. It works if you have one. They still support it minimally on the units, but it is not. It's not being sold anymore, and it's not really being actively supported. And games that, if you have any games that support it, they still support it, but any new games are not going to support the Kinect because it has been discontinued. In fact, it was discontinued, I think, in 2017. Kinect. After failing to attract interest from game developers and users, Microsoft also began to phase out the Kinect from the consumer market, removing the proprietary connector used by these devices on the newer Xbox models and requiring a special adapter to break the connector out into USB and AC power connections. Yeah, so you had to get that special adapter. If you didn't have the adapter, you couldn't hook it up to the Xbox One S or X. You had to have the adapter. And the adapter is like almost impossible to find now because they've discontinued the entire Kinect piece. So let me see. When was Kinect discontinued? To 2017. Yeah, so it was discontinued in 2017 when I said. I thought it was 2017. Anyway, this Dreamcast here is one of my favorite all-time consoles from all of the past consoles. It sort of culminated everything from all of the past consoles into a really great console with a reasonably good fitting, good feeling joystick in the hand. It also had the VMU, so you had this little display that was on your joypad that you could see something. It wasn't a great video thing, but it did have other stuff that it could show up there, so it was interesting that you could use it. You could also pull it out and take it with you and take mini games with you and play them and then pop them back into the game, and then it would download whatever you did in the mini game into the full game. So you had some add-ons with the VMU, which is what I really kind of like that. And no other console really has grasped that kind of add-on capability, unfortunately. I really kind of liked that. I guess in a way the Switch kind of has, but only from the fact that you can grab the Switch and take it with you and play, and then put it back in the dock and play again. So the Nintendo Switch has kind of taken that to the next level. Might as well show it here since I'm talking about it. So this is the Nintendo Switch, in case you're wondering what it looks like. But yeah, this sort of takes that to the next level. This is not a bad video game system. It's not a bad system. Not a great system, but not a bad system. It needs a facelift. It's several years old at this point, so Nintendo needs to do something to facelift it. But for what it is, it's not bad. It plays well. I don't play it often, but it's an okay console. Now it claims the Nintendo Switch competes with the Xbox One and Sony's PlayStation 4, but I don't really think that's true. It doesn't really compete with it. It's really more of a portable. It really competes more against its own handhelds like the Game Boy. I mean, it really competes against the DS, and that's really kind of why it has sort of pushed the DS out of existence, because it sort of has replaced the DS in functionality. In fact, the Nintendo Switch Mini, or whatever they call that smaller version, kind of pushed out the DS. Nintendo Switch Mini. I don't know what it's called.